Julian, Nigeria, $510 billion in terms of the rebasing of the GDP status, making it the biggest economy on the African continent. We have heard repeatedly throughout the forum, many saying that size doesn't matter in this instance. We need to work together, especially South Africa and Nigeria. Are you unlocking the opportunity that Nigeria presents from a sheer size perspective?
I think there is undoubtedly huge progress that's been made, but really to unlock that potential, there's a lot more that needs to be done. You know, we often focus on infrastructure, and we focus on, you know, railways and roads. The Chinese premier was talking about it. But actually, from my point of view, there is the financial services that needs to be done. The cross-border payments need to be speeded up. And I think what's happened in East Africa is leading the way, as we just heard earlier, that the payment systems, the countries are working together. So I think there are real opportunities in each individual country, but the real power will come in when we can get Africa working really closely together.
Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, if we can go back to Nigeria. In Addis Ababa at the World Economic Forum, we were sitting on a similar stage, and I remember there discussing the issue of the free movement of people and capital and goods, specifically visa requirements. Minister Gordhan has said, let's not talk about visa requirements and the dropping of visa requirements, but rather let's talk about boosting intra-Africa trade, which sits at 12%. It isn't growing from that level. I know previously you've spoken about the informal trade sector that we need to take into account here. But surely there's some short-term wins we can do, Minister, so that when we are at the World Economic Forum in Africa, the 25th, which will be in South Africa next year, we're not talking about the same things when it comes to the free movement of capital, goods, and people.
Within the West African region, we don't need visas to move around. And I think even in Nigeria here, we've taken the decision that business people who genuinely want to invest come in can get visas at the borders. But among ourselves, those coming from other communities, we're going to try to implement that to make it easier. So yes, I believe that we should increasingly, by next year, see policies that prevent us from interacting with each other go away. Those that can be done by a stroke of a pen. But then we have to also work on those things that are much more difficult in the medium and long term, which have to do with the hard infrastructure. And I have some good news there. The West African presidents have decided in ECOWAS that they're going to build a coastal highway to connect all the countries. And they've signed Abidjan, Lagos to Abidjan, and eventually to go all the way to Dakar. You know, so we're starting with that. We're very optimistic about that. That's a concrete expression of the need. Once we have that and you can travel all the way without being stopped, that's going to boost trade so much and bring the informal within the formal sector.
Minister Gordhan, what can South Africa do to contribute to fast-tracking this process, the free movement, goods, people, and capital?
We've gone a long way in that direction already. If you take the question of movement of capital, South African firms today have a presence in most African countries. The financial sector, telecommunications, retail, mining services, and year after year we've adjusted our exchange controls and other provisions in order to ensure that firstly South African firms can take capital out, and in fact preferential treatment is given to those South African firms that want to invest in Africa. So if you take it elsewhere in the world, there's a different set of rules, but we've encouraged investment in Africa, and it certainly has worked. If you come to South Africa today, I would imagine that 3/4 of the African continent will have people in South Africa in one form or another. So both formally and informally, both in the professions and outside of the professions, South Africa has any number of people outside of the South African population that are there. On the movement of goods, state-owned entities like Transnet have certainly provided access right up to the DRC and other parts of Central and Eastern West Africa, or the western part of Central Africa. but a lot more needs to be done. So I think there's a consciousness about that. There's excellent work going on in the infrastructure program that we've worked out both in the AU and now with WEF as well. And we're getting to a point where a pipeline of projects like the one that my colleague and sister is talking about are there. We need to turn them into bankable projects. The financial sector is also coming to the party, so that's excellent as well. As far as the payment systems are concerned, I think we have a fairly good one in Southern Africa. And what we need now is the connectivity. If you look at stock exchanges, there's two people sitting in the front row here representing Joburg Stock Exchange and the Nigerian Stock Exchange. So they're working together. If we look at deepening capital markets across the African continent, of course, South Africa has the deepest of those markets, but a lot of good work is happening in terms of sharing expertise and enabling some of those things to actually happen.
One of the starting points that I've identified is the poverty, the energy poverty that we have on the African continent. And let's just throw some of the stats out there. 7 out of 10 Africans do not have access to electricity. 2% of Burundians and South Sudanese have access to electricity. 3% of Liberians have access to electricity. In Nigeria, with a population of 170 million people, half of those people live in darkness, and the other half have access to unreliable electricity. And in the sub-Saharan business surveys, many businesses, almost 70% of those businesses are saying that one of the biggest constraints to growth is unreliable electricity. Isn't this a short-term win? Isn't this where regional integration can leverage something like Inga Dam, which apparently from a hydropower perspective can electrify half of the African continent? Can't we use the might in this room to say, let's get that foreign direct investment. Let's leverage the International Finance Corporation. Let's get Inga Dam working. Let's electrify. Then what we can do is we can help economic growth, we can help human development, because power, I stand corrected if I'm being too passionate about this, is at the center of everything. Minister.
You're looking at me.
Yes, I am.
Yes, of course. If every survey you do on the continent, and particularly in my country, the biggest constraint, the last survey, 53% of businesses said that power is the single biggest constraint in their way in Nigeria. The second was access to finance. And so this is, but where I was looking at you is because it's not that quick a win. If it were such a quick win, we would have won it. I'm glad to say that in Nigeria, we are almost winning it, because after a decade of trying to run and then privatize, the public power utilities, and it's not easy, because, there are vested interests. There are people who have been working here in a public utility for a long time, but there's no ideological battle here. The point was that we were not able to manage this well, and we know we have to deliver power. So we've done one of the most radical reforms of the power sector. We've liberalized the sector so anyone can come in and invest in power. And we have a wonderful example, which was just signed here at this World Economic Forum on the margins of the Azura Power, $1 billion in investment in, 15 or 14 investors, the creme de la creme, both multilaterals and private equity and banks, international banks, put in 700 million into a power plant and another 300 million into gas to power. This is what we want to do. In addition, we've sold off all generation, sold off all distribution in a very transparent manner, which no one to date has criticized and said that anything was done wrong. And then we've only kept transmission. So I think these kinds of radical reforms, what we want to demonstrate to our people and our business community that really we are serious about getting this power and solving the problem. Now, just to say that these investments take a little bit of time to mature. So it's not overnight. There'll be a transition period. I suspect we'll need a year to a year and a half before, we'll begin to see the benefits of increased hours of supply.
The stat being quoted is that if we manage to reduce that energy poverty, if we bring, let's say, the 700 million people on the African continent into the power grid with off-grid solutions. I'm not saying they need to be on-grid. Let's not go into that discussion now. But if we reduce that number to 0, those people who don't have access to electricity, that we can leverage or we can increase our growth, GDP growth, by 2 to 5% in countries across Africa, somewhere between 2 to 5%. Imagine what that's going to do to the 5.5% GDP growth outlook that the IMF is forecasting for Africa. I want to go back to the regionalization now. Inga Dam, I don't want to leave this as a potential solution because I think this has got to come back into the conversation, Minister. Inga Dam is one of the opportunities that we could show solidarity on the African continent to transform the power situation.
Well, South Africa, for example, buys power and has been doing so for a couple of decades from the Cahora Bassa hydro project. So that's regional cooperation. Eskom supplies power to most of our neighbors in South Africa, notwithstanding some of our own difficulties at the moment. So I think we do have elements of regional cooperation. But be careful, GDP numbers in themselves don't say much apart from, how well the growth in the size of your economy is taking place. But the theme of this forum is inclusive growth. So you can have all the electricity in the world. If your consumers can't afford to pay for them at a household level, no point in having all of that power. So, yes.
Are you becoming negative here now?
No.
Sorry, I just wanted to double check.
Pragmatic. So what we require is certainly what you are saying. We actually discussed, some of us, the Inga project for the last 2 days. It'll happen. But it's a medium-term project. It's not a quick win.
It's taken many, many decades to this point. Can we at least do this, please? Could we put a time frame to it? Let's forget about the last 30 years.
We will send you as our emissary to the DRC to see how you can manage this for us. So then at least some of your passion can be exercised in the right kind of way there.
But Praveen, I have to, in fairness to Bromwell, we need to tell her that actually considerable progress has been made.
No,
thank you, Minister.
We'll soon be there with Inga. We'll just give us another few months to get the agreement. And it's $11 billion for the first stage. Okay, so it's that money also has to be structured and brought in.
It's time to let you into some business tidbits. Understand the vision of the business or project and keep it at the forefront at all times. Prioritize the success of the organization over personal interests in advancement. Recruit talented people by identifying the needs of each position and matching them with workers who are skilled and passionate about the work. Deal with issues as soon as possible. Act decisively. After weighing all important factors, avoid unnecessary delays in making decisions. Treating everyone with honesty and respect increases their trust in your ability to lead. Examine your intentions when offering criticism. Always consider the impact of your words and whether they will lead to the good of the worker or situation. That will be all for now. Please do send us your comments and questions on the economy to Business Incorporated at channelstv.com. You may also reach us on Twitter. We'll be glad to hear from you. Thank you for watching. I am Bolaji Akinwale.